Hi class, let's get started with our discussion on skin diseases and also diseases of the eye. So, diving into the material, let's first talk about our skin. The second half of this chapter, and it's only like the second fourth or quarter of this chapter, is dedicated to this eye. Most of this chapter is going to be dedicated to skin diseases. So first, if we look at the general hierarchy or breakdown of the chapter, we'll have a section on the skin, its defenses, the normal microbiota, and then we'll also have a section on the skin and diseases of the skin. Then we'll break out and talk about the eye and its defenses, the normal microbiota of the eye, and then the diseases of the eye. So without further ado, let's talk about the defenses of the skin. Our skin, aka integument, is a barrier. It forms a boundary between the inside of our bodies and the outside of our bodies. It keeps the fluids in and it keeps pathogens out. Our skin is made up primarily of hair, skin, nails, sweat, and oil glands. Now, when we see sweat, for those of you who are wondering what we're talking about with sweat, there are two kinds of sweat glands, or sudoriferous glands, and there's one primary kind of oil gland, also known as a sebaceous gland. Our skin's a big organ. It's the largest organ in the body. It comprises 1.5 to 2 square meters of total surface area, depending on the size of the person. Obviously, bigger people have more surface area than smaller people. And our skin can vary greatly in thickness. It can be quite thin, 1.5 millimeters at the eyelids, to greater than 4 millimeters on the soles of our feet. Particularly if we're looking at a corn or a callus, it can be up to 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter thick. The most superficial layer of the skin is known as the epidermis. Epi means above, dermis means skin. This is the above skin layer. The epidermis technically is not alive. It's made of 5 different layers, though. The most superficial layer is made of fully keratinized or fully cornified cells, and that's the stratum corneum. Stratum is a word that means, or a word that refers to layers. So stratum corneum means the cornified layer, and it's one of the thickest layers of the epidermis as well. It's up to 25 cells thick. These cells can be migrating up constantly from the lower levels of the epidermis. Our entire epidermis, all of our superficial skin, can be replaced in as short as 25 days or as long as 45 days. These skin cells that are being sloughed off as we're constantly replacing our skin make up the majority of the dust that's in our homes. The protein that waterproofs and toughens our skin is known as keratin. This is also the primary ingredient of protein of our hair and the primary protein of our fingernails. As an aside, it's also the primary protein of rhinoceros horns. We have a bottom or basement layer of our epidermis, the stratum basale. So we have the stratum corneum on top, and then there's several other layers, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in the bottom layer, we'll have the stratum basale. That stratum basale is 1 cell thick. It's a monolayer, 1 cell thick, that is made of living cells. This is where we regenerate or rejuvenate the cells of our epidermis. So if we look at this figure here, we can see a profile relief of the skin. The epidermis is on the surface. The stratum corneum makes up most of the epidermis. It is the single thickest layer of the epidermis. And then we have that single layer at the bottom called the stratum basale. Deep to the epidermis, we'll have the dermis. This contains the blood vessels and most of the sensory receptors of the skin. And then deep to the dermis, we have the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. Our dermis is going to have a lot of connective tissue. The connective tissues that are present in the dermis typically are going to be loose, irregular connective tissues or dense, irregular connective tissues. There's lots of fibers in the dermis. Those fibers are made by a specific cell type known as a fibroblast. It is a cell that builds fibers. One of the fibers that the fibroblast will build includes collagen fibers, and there's also several other fiber types that we'll focus on in other classes. We also have many macrophages present in the dermis. Recall, a macrophage is a phagocyte. It is a large cell that will phagocytize pathogens that it is exposed to. And then we have mast cells. Those mast cells are a cell of the immune system that help to mediate immune functions, particularly allergic reactions. We're also going to have a very dense network of blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels within the dermis. These, particularly the dense network of blood vessels within the dermis, allows for that stratum basale of the epidermis to receive enough nutrition through diffusion that basement layer of the epidermis can still be alive and rapidly reproducing. If we damage our dermis, we're going to start breaking blood vessels. A big way we can differentiate between a superficial injury and a deeper injury is the presence of blood. If we cut ourselves and we start to bleed, we know that we've gone down into the dermis. Occasionally, you'll have abrasions or cuts that only go into the epidermis and don't go all the way down into the dermis. If a blister forms on our skin, that blister is going to be the resulting structure that forms from the epidermis being separated from the dermis. Usually this is the result of friction. Occasionally this can be the result of heat. Within the dermis, we have follicles that contain our hairs. We also have our sebaceous glands, aka oil glands, that secrete sebum. Sebum is not necessarily oil. Sebum is mostly phospholipids, but also contains lots of carbohydrates and proteins. There are two different kinds of sweat glands, the apocrine and the eccrine sweat glands that are found in the dermis as well. And we'll also have other glands on the skin that pass through the epidermis. These could be mucus glands. Millions of cells of the stratum corneum are constantly being shed daily. As we're constantly shedding off these cells of the stratum corneum, which is that most superficial layer of the epidermis, we're also going to be shedding off the microorganisms with those cells that are trying to penetrate our epidermis. On the surface of our skin, we have antimicrobial peptides. These antimicrobial peptides primarily reach the surface of our skin from the sebum that's secreted by the sebaceous glands and from our sweat as well. These antimicrobial peptides have overall net positive charges, and those overall net positive charges allow them to disrupt the overall negatively charged membranes of bacteria. We have a plethora of different peptides that have antimicrobial properties, and they help to keep the microbial count on our skin relatively low. If it wasn't for these peptides, we would have a free-for-all on our skin. That sebum from the sebaceous gland, commonly referred to as oil from the oil gland, has a very low pH in it. This low pH means that it's acidic, and it means that our skin is inhospitable to many microorganisms. It's primarily referred to oil because it has such a high concentration of lipids. It also has some byproducts of fatty acid metabolism. These byproducts of fatty acid metabolism, generally speaking, are going to be toxic to both us and to any bacteria that are on the surface of the skin. Most of our toxic byproducts from fatty acid metabolism are going to be urinated out and filtered out of our blood by the kidneys, but we'll also secrete some of them onto the surface of our skin via our sebum. Though for the microbes that can withstand the low pH and those toxic byproducts, they can thrive and live off of the lipids that are being secreted onto the surface of our skin. Those lipids can be used as a carbon source for those microbes. Our sweat also is going to have a low pH as well, but in addition to having a low pH, our sweat is also going to be quite saline or have a high salt concentration. So we have already on the surface of our skin, we've talked about an acidic pH, we've talked about antimicrobial proteins, we've talked about how it's disposable, we're constantly shedding the outer layer of our skin, and now I've also mentioned that we have high salt concentrations on the surface of our skin. Our skin is naturally inhospitable to most microorganisms, thank goodness. We also have a lysozyme. A lysozyme is an enzyme that's present on the surface of our skin and in other places of our body. This enzyme can be found in sweat, tears, salivas, and is particularly designed to break down peptidoglycan. If you don't recall, peptidoglycan is the specific carbohydrate that makes up the cell walls of both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. But since gram-positive bacteria have more peptidoglycan and their peptidoglycan exposed on the surface, they are going to be more susceptible to the lysozymes than gram-negative bacterium. So, concept check class. You should rewind the video to find an answer, pause it, and flip back in your notes or check your text. Which substance produced by the skin is metabolized by normal microbiota, producing toxic byproducts that inhibit the growth of potential pathogens? Is it keratin, lysozyme, sebum, sweat, or antimicrobial peptides? So pause the video and get me an answer. Five. All right, the answer is C, sebum. Sebum contains lipids that can be metabolized by normal microbiota. It also contains toxic byproducts from fat breakdown, and is going to also contain a acidic pH to help inhibit the growth of pathogens. If you have any questions about the general defenses of our skin, please feel free to post them on the discussion board or shoot me an email. Happy studies, class.